chat. Okay, welcome everyone to another Leadership Launchpad Pick and Mix podcast, and I am giddy with excitement. And I've just been explaining to David off camera about I can't really believe that he's here because he's had a secret kind of behind the scenes impact on my leadership development ever since I kind of tripped over his work. And I'm excited for everyone to hear a bit more about that as we go through the podcast. So I'm just going to share the slides as normal, and then you can get started.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll get David to introduce himself in a bit more detail in a moment. But yeah, he's a professor in leadership at Henley Business School. And so without further ado, let's get stuck into that. So David, tell us a bit about kind of what does it mean to be a professor in leadership?
Well, it typically means, of course, that you've reached a certain sort of level of achievement, I guess, and that's why I'm a full professor rather than an associate or an assistant professor or whatever it may be. Although, of course, universities in the UK didn't used to use the American nomenclature about professors, but we do now. So I've been appointed that, and I've been a professor there for 8 years. But the most important thing I can tell you is that most of my life, as a helper of people to understand leadership issues, has been in the context of consultancy. I was a co-founder with my wife Jenny King of the Edgecombe Consulting Group. We're a firm of business psychologists, so Jenny and I are both psychologists. Did our doctorates together, met doing our doctorates together, and it was that sort of took me into the world of initially education, and then the world of medical practice, and then into the world of commerce and industry to try and apply my psychology to try and help make individuals, teams and organisations more effective. And at the end of my consultancy career, Henley asked me to become a professor there. So I said I would willingly do that, and I've been doing that, as I say, for the last 8 years.
Yeah, amazing. And that's a good segue into, and we talked a bit offline about my engagement with your work. And for those who haven't, I mean, the first thing you need to do when you come off this is to, I guess Google Primary Colours leadership model. Would that be the thing they Google?
Yeah, or just Leadership No More Heroes, which is the title of the book, which is the third edition of the work I've been doing on leadership.
Yeah, amazing. And so I'm gonna rejig these questions really, because I'm really interested in kind of your work pre-professorship then, I suppose, because again that's the work I've engaged with most of it, and offline we talked about, and I think it's worth re-talking about that because I think it'll resonate really well with the listeners, is this idea that when I first discovered the Primary Colours leadership model, it felt like such a clear, kind of well-structured, almost gateway into the complexities of leadership for me. Tell us a bit about how that came about, and
Well, the first thing I should tell you is that I came into the field of leadership about 25 years ago.
Right.
And what I discovered, having looked back over what was going on for the previous few decades in the field of leadership, what I discovered, depressingly, was that the field of leadership is a mess.
Yeah.
Exclamation mark. A mess, a big mess, because people are more concerned to find new things than to find the things that are robust and well evidence-based and so on. And so it's a world of fads and fashions, and not very strong evidence base underneath it all. And yet there is a strong evidence base about leadership if you're prepared to dig it out. So what I tried to do was to think about what are the three most important sources of insights about leadership that I had. And so whatever I've done have been at the confluence of three streams. The first is that I've been a leader in my own right. I started my own business. I was an HR director for a FTSE 100 company on secondment from my consultancy for a couple of years. I looked after the HR team briefly at IATA in Geneva for a short time. So I've been at the top table of big organisations. I've founded my own consultancy and so I've been a leader. But the second thing I've done is been a consultant. So I've seen up close leadership in a variety of different contexts from all over the world. I've worked on 4 different continents as a consultant, and I've worked in just about every sphere of human endeavour. So public sector, private sector, charity sector. I've worked in manufacturing, retail, hotels, airlines, you name it. I've kind of been there because, of course, I'm agnostic as to sector because I'm a psychologist. So people are my business, and people are everywhere. So, and then the third is the academic route. I've looked at the leadership research and conducted some of my own and published on that. So the confluence of those 3 streams is as a leader, as a consultant, and as an academic. And what I decided to write about was, firstly, the evidence that people can depend upon, and then secondly, to try to make a complex field like leadership much more easily understandable. Now, I think I mentioned to you before we started to record this that the nicest compliment that was paid to my work on primary colours and leadership was that the person who was talking to me quoted Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that I would give nothing for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give everything for the simplicity on the far side of complexity. And he reckoned that my books on leadership were the simplicity on the far side of complexity. So he was trying to suggest that I'd understood the complexity and then re-simplify to make it more accessible.
Yeah. Well, and that is fascinating for me because I've been on a similar journey in that I thought I understood a fair bit about leadership prior to doing my doctorate in leadership, and then the more I learned, the more confused I got. And I was like, oh God, I thought I had this, and now and of course then I started surprising people because they would say, hey, so Chris, tell us about the leadership. What is it? And I said, I don't really know. And they'd say, what do you mean? You just spent 5 years. And I'm like, yeah, I'm still in the muddle, in the messiness. And I like your use of the phrase, if you're willing to dig it out. Because it does feel a bit like that sometimes, doesn't it?
Yes, it's a bit like mining for diamonds, isn't it? You've got to shift an awful lot of rubbish before you find something valuable. But the thing about leadership, I think, is if you start at first principles, and that is ask the question, what is it that leaders have to do or get done? Yeah. I think it's a good place to start. And so I decided that leadership really had to cover 3 domains, and you'll be familiar with these. There's the strategic domain, because leaders have to think about tomorrow and where we're going, not where we are. We have to think about a journey that we're on and how do we get from here to a better place. So there's the strategic domain, which is all about tomorrow. And of course, because it's about tomorrow, there are very few facts in the strategic domain. It's largely about possibilities. And therefore, there's a great deal of uncertainty in that domain. Then there's the operational domain, which is all about today, and it's full of facts and details and Gantt charts and projects and aims and objectives and plans and this, that and the other. And that the challenge, if the challenge in the strategic domain is dealing with uncertainty, the challenge in the operational domain is dealing with complexity. Right. And then there's the interpersonal domain, because clearly this is a journey that we're not going to take alone. We're going to try to take people with us on this journey. And so the interpersonal domain is all about the people that we're going to recruit in, sustain, and develop on our journey from here to a better place. The challenge there is dealing with ambiguity, because you and I and other human beings on this planet are not exactly straightforward. So So, the American military in the 1980s came up with this idea of VUCA, this term meaning that, it was hard for them to plan how to fight the next war because of the world they were in was volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. Mm-hmm. Now that's, I think, now 40 odd years old. But what I think it's come down to is that the world now is difficult for leaders, in fact, everyone to navigate because of two factors, not four. One is the sheer pace at which change happens, and the other is the sheer unpredictability of it. So when you've got the interaction of speed and unpredictability, you've got to be thinking quite hard about how to prepare an organisation, a team, or even yourself for that kind of future.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that'll resonate really strongly. I mean, most of the listeners at the moment on the podcast are from education,
mm-hmm.
and I think that kind of, when people come across the primary colours model, they'll see that there's this Venn diagram sort of element to it, and the interplay between, again, strategic, operational, and interpersonal. And for me, it was really groundbreaking at the beginning because it helped me frame my own self-assessment of my leadership. As I said before, kind of a gateway. I was able to say, okay, at the broadest level, I don't think I'm as good operationally as I am strategically. That's where I'm going to invest some time and energy initially. And of course, as you get into it, you get into the weeds and it gets more complex. Okay, well, again, we could just derail the whole of what we planned and just talk about that.
Well, it's important, I think, Chris, to underline the point that's implicit in what you're saying, because I've got 4 propositions in the primary colours approach to leadership. The first one is that the primary colours model describes the territory of leadership. So it's like a map. It's not describing a journey. It's describing the territory. It's saying this is what you'll find there. And there are 7+1 leadership tasks that need to get done. Things like setting strategic direction or creating alignment, or in the operational domain, delivering results and so on. But the second, and perhaps even the most important proposition, is the second one, which is it's really hard to be good at all of it. Right. What you find is that on our own life journey, and therefore our developmental journey as leaders as well, we learn to become more proficient in certain aspects of leadership than others. Mm-hmm. So I like you, am better in the strategic and the interpersonal domains than I am in the operational domain. I once noticed a detail, didn't like it, and it, I didn't know quite what to do with it, so I had to ask someone who was good with that. But the point is, though, that if you buy into that idea, it takes you in a very important and I think helpful direction, which is to say, if I can't be a complete leader, then where are we going to get complete leadership from? And that's what we need, is complete leadership. And of course, the answer is incomplete leaders working together in teams of complementary differences can have complete leadership. But the thought that David Pendleton or Chris Baker can do it on our own is something which is worth putting aside and forgetting about, because I and my colleagues in the consultancy that I founded and ran for 20 years, we assessed between us literally thousands of leaders all over the world, and we didn't find one who was world-class in all aspects of leadership. Now, that's either the world's worst sampling error or it's something that you have to take into account and start to work with.
Yeah. And that speaks a little bit to what you said at the very beginning about there probably are some fundamental things that we should spend time accepting rather than looking for the new stuff all the time. Okay, well, let's get stuck into the podcast then, and this idea that you've selected some things ahead of time that we're going to talk about, some questions, some launch pads from the book, and some kind of ignition points, which, again, the style of the podcast is about learning more about you as an individual, as a leader. And so the first thing that you chose in terms of a question was fascinating. If you could change anything about the way you were raised, what would it be? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I am the overeducated only child of two almost completely uneducated parents. Now, they were wonderful, kind, salt of the earth, delightful human beings. I'm very lucky to have had them as parents. But the thing that I want to celebrate about that upbringing was that it was completely stabilizing. I never doubted that my parents loved me. I never doubted that they believed in me. I never doubted that they were proud of me. And all of the things that sort of give people self-respect, my parents did in spades. But they both left school at 14. And as a result of that, and they'd hardly ever travelled. My father had travelled only during the war. And they'd not really been out of the country much. And so the one thing I always kind of felt frustrated that my parents couldn't give me was this notion of a map. I didn't want them to plot my journey through life, but I'd have liked them to have been able to say, well, David, if you go in that direction, you find these sorts of things. If you go in that direction, you find these other sorts of things. Yeah. But they really didn't know. So that's the one thing that if I could have changed something, that's the one thing it would have been, that my parents would have been a bit more savvy about the world. But nothing else. They were great.
Well, and that's interesting. I mean, that resonates really strongly with me because I've got a very similar background, really, where my parents were non-academic but amazing people. And yeah, that idea of potentially, I wonder if they'd been more academic, whether they would have been less good at the other stuff. And maybe, as well as we can't have leaders that are great at everything, maybe we can't have parents that are great at everything. That's interesting. Okay.
Well, the thing about education, though, is that I'm on record as having declared that the purpose of education is to enable curiosity. Okay. And by that I mean two things. One is to encourage curiosity, but the other is to equip people who are curious to be able to find things out. And I think that the lack of education often shows up as an absence of both of those things. Right. One of the things that I value my education for is that it did both of those things. It encouraged me to be curious and also equipped me to be curious and find things out. And I think that's a piece of what I'm saying here, is that my delightful folks took an awful lot of things at face value, and they regarded the route to stability and happiness was acceptance rather than investigation. Right. And that's the one thing I would have liked to have been different. But of course, because they enabled me to go through university, they sacrificed to make sure that I didn't need to leave education as early as I could have. They encouraged me to go on not just to sixth form but also to university, and then ultimately to do my doctorate. Yeah. They made an awful lot possible, and so although they didn't enable curiosity in the traditional way, they enabled it in another way by making sure that I could indulge my curiosity by being supported by them.
I love that. That's really great, isn't it? Well, the next thing we're going to talk about, again, is one of these ignition points, so a moment in your life that transformed you. And so tell us a bit about, what was life like before, what was the ignition point, and how did it transform you?
I'm going to have to try and remember what I wrote in my questionnaire about these things. I think that each time I was able to break through an educational barrier, right, it became an ignition point. I once asked my mum, I'm an only child, so I once asked my mum, of all the things that she and my father had enabled me to do, what was the thing that she was proudest of? And she, bless her, I thought, she'd say going to Oxford, No. She said passing your 11 plus.
Did she really?
Yeah, and I think two things about that. I think firstly, that's the thing that I did that she fully understood.
Right.
You know, because her experience had not been about universities or, you know, doing PhDs or anything. But she understood what it was like to break through early on in life. Now, of course, the 11 plus has gone in most parts of the country, but it did give, you know, a relatively ordinary kid from a very, very ordinary background and home the opportunity then to change my peer group.
Yes.
And I think that ignition point was this change in expectations that the change in peer group prompted. And each time I broke through, so going to university did the same thing again. It refined the peer group again. And then being able to do my DPhil at Oxford changed my peer group again and changed the expectations therefore. And so I think that that's one ignition point that I would talk about, and it's really in several parts. It's that each transition to a new peer group changed my expectations, and that kind of spurred me on to change the way I set my store to achieve things in life.
Yeah. Again, lots of stuff resonating with me as well, and that I, similar to you, was constrained, I think, I didn't know at the time, constrained by my peer group early on. And it wasn't until I went to kind of university, and even then I was in a fairly, still quite tight, peer group. But then I started traveling and listening to people who were very demographically similar to me, but their aspirations were way beyond what I'd ever thought about. And that revelation of, hang on a minute, we're not dissimilar, and yet we are dissimilar in the way we think, raised my aspirations. And after that, I then purposely sought out different peer groups to extend my aspirations, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I wanted from my kids, both of whom are now grown up, and so I want the same thing now for my grandchildren, is exactly that. It's that be careful who you hang out with, basically. To some extent, we are defined by the people that we associate with. So I just say choose them wisely, if you can.
Yeah. I think that's, to tie it back to leadership and just professional development in general, I think that's one of the reasons why I would encourage people to develop external links, whether that is through social media or organisations, because exposure to and connection with additional perspectives and viewpoints, for me, has been a transformational bit, I guess, of my leadership journey. Great. Well, let's keep pushing on so that we don't run out of time. And so we're now going to move into the first kind of launch pad that David chose. And as usual, I'll explain a little bit about where it came from when I created it, and then Dave can kind of expand on why it resonates with him. And so the first one probably won't be kind of new to lots of people if they've done some of the core readings that lots of us seem to be doing. But there's this idea that we have to be clear to be kind. It's Brene Brown's kind of statement, but the effective professional development and performance management actually is only truly effective if people are honest and direct, and even when that's quite tricky to do. And so if you've connected with any of the work of Kim Scott, you'll be familiar with this idea, or Brene Brown, that probably not being particularly kind to people if we're feeding them half-truths to make them feel better, or that if we're not clear about any expectations but still hold people accountable to them. And then this idea that, if we're talking about people rather than talking to them, that's kind of, it's not very kind. And as I said, the Kim Scott stuff you'll be familiar with, I'm sure, as listeners, around this idea of you know, caring personally, but also challenging directly. These four quadrants, this idea that when we care more than we challenge, we can be ruinously empathetic, and that we can care so much that we don't challenge enough to actually change people. People tend to ignore, our advice when we're doing that. There's this idea that it becomes a bit negative where we don't care about people and we don't challenge them, and so that is kind of insincere manipulation. Kim Scott talks a bit about this idea that you can go to the other extreme where you're so intent on telling people the truth, but you do it in an uncaring way that you are obnoxiously aggressive. And then, of course, she talks a bit about the sweet spot being this idea. Apologies for the wording on there, but she's now changed. Originally it was called radical candor, and she's since recognised that, as most people do, they mutated that into overly radical, and so this idea of compassionate candor. I'll let you read the rest of this in your own time, but just tell us a bit about why that resonates with you, David.
Firstly, I think it's easy to confuse with the notion of you have to be cruel to be kind,
Sure.
which is, of course, the obnoxious aggression idea. You don't need to be cruel to be kind.
Yeah.
I'd also like to suggest that you could put it the other way around. In order to be really clear, you've got to be kind.
Right.
And that's because the whole purpose of... This is all about feedback, right?
Yeah.
The whole purpose of feedback is to enable someone to change. In order for them to be enabled to change, they first of all need to want to change.
Yeah, exactly.
So, if you're going to sort of write them off and say something about them which is likely to cause either a defensive reaction or a resistant reaction, then you don't even throw a six to start. There's no way they want to change. I am known in the medical world for what are called the Pendleton rules of feedback, which always starts with good points first. Right. And the reason for that is that in contradistinction to the way medical education used to be a generation ago, 25 years ago or so, and I was writing with GPs who'd been brought up in that tradition. One of them told me that a medical tutor of his had told him that if he had an IQ of 1 less, he'd be a plant. And it was education by humiliation. Yeah. And so we came up with this notion of let's deal with, first of all, what someone does well, because that's the foundation on which you're going to build. Right. And so enabling people to change starts with them wanting to change, but then secondly, being clear about how to change. Right. And so it's the reason we start with good points first is, funnily enough, not to be kind. Mm-hmm. It's just simply to start with the foundation on which we will build. Yeah. So, but if you're going to try to help someone to change, they need to know what and how to change. So the whole Pendleton rules of feedback, which get quoted to me all the time, and my poor younger daughter, who is a doctor now, was raised up, just sick to death of hearing about the Pendleton rules of feedback. The point about it is that when you're trying to help someone learn, you have to be as forensically clear about what they do well, mm-hmm. as well as what they need to change and why. Yeah. So the rules said, start with the good points, and then instead of pointing to endless weaknesses or deficiencies, simply switch that into recommendations. Right. So instead of saying, I noticed that you didn't ask the patient, when the disease started. I noticed that you didn't ask the patient, da-da-da-da-da-da. Instead, the recommendations would be, instead of doing X, try doing Y. Right. Instead of doing A, try doing B. Make the recommendation. So either way you win. You either get you either get the opportunity to discuss in great detail how it was you succeeded at doing something, and you need to be clear about that, or you get an opportunity to think about how and why you could raise your game.
Yeah.
Either way, it feels like a win. And funnily enough, the motivation is not to be kind, in my opinion. It's to help someone learn and grow. Now, that might, as a byproduct, feel kind. Good, I hope it does. But the whole point about all of this, for me, is that it's all really about clarity and in many ways trying to take the emotion out of it. What we want to do is to have people live unequivocally here in order to be able to grasp in detail those things that they need to be able to repeat, so that their strengths are very controllable and they can manifest them at any given time.
Yeah.
Or they know exactly what to do to raise their game by doing something differently.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And the thing that resonates with me there is this idea that potentially if you go in, negatively early on, you put them here, don't you? You put them on the back foot, you make them engage emotionally because, that's how you're leading. You're almost backing them into a corner, and whether that damages their receipt or their acceptance or acknowledgement of all of the other stuff that comes after that.
Yep. I use a slightly different 2x2 to this one. I talk about the interaction between challenge and support.
Okay.
And of course, being the top right-hand corner is the place to be, where you're not balancing challenge with support. What you're doing is maximising both challenge and support. Yeah. And in fact, you can argue that either way around. The more you're prepared to support people, the more you are able to challenge them.
Yes.
Or the more challenging the circumstances in which people find themselves, the more they need support. You can argue it either way, but you actually need both. And that's the way I like to work with this idea. That we can create the conditions. As you know, my whole philosophy of leadership is about creating the conditions for success.
Yeah.
And this is one of the ways we can create a particular set of conditions for learning.
I love that. And again, to go back to primary colours, for me, that idea that leaders would potentially don't invest or don't strive to be better at the interpersonal, potentially damage their ability to challenge. I mean, if I think about my work as an executive coach, the longer the relationship or the deeper the relationship, the more I can be challenging, because I've set the groundwork for that to happen. Interesting.
Well, I think what you're demonstrating is a principle in your diagram here, and that if you care about somebody, the longer you've been around them, the more they realise that you care about them, and then you can be much more direct. So I remember I was working at the Royal College of General Practitioners on one occasion, and I was working with one of the very senior officers of the Royal College who'd been voted in by, their 50-odd thousand members. And this was a woman who had a reputation for not always being easy to deal with. And I remember bringing her to the front of the room, and I asked her, firstly, I said, "Do I like you?" And she said, "Yes, I think you do." I said, "Secondly, do I respect you?" And she said, "Yes, I think you do." And then I said, "Do I care about you?"
Okay.
And she said, "Yes, I think you do." I said, "Right then. So if I want to give you some challenging feedback in that context, is that okay?" She said yes. And what I got her to see is that, do I care about you? Yes. Hi. Okay. So now I can afford to be direct with you.
Yeah, I love that. Right. Well, let's keep pushing on because this is fascinating. So in terms of the second fast friends question that David chose, tell us a bit about what you value most in friendship.
two or three things. One, reciprocity. You can't have a one-way friendship. If I invite you to dinner at my house, I expect at some point to be invited back to dinner at yours. It's not just a transactional relationship, but if I say good morning to you, I expect you to say good morning back to me. I expect some sort of reciprocity, that this is, that we are both making the running on this. I about every 6 weeks have lunch with a good friend of mine called Nigel B. and Powell, and we always go to the same restaurant. In fact, funny enough, we always order exactly the same meal because we like
really?
it. But the thing is that if I've forgotten to put the next date in the diary, he will contact me.
Right.
And if he's forgotten, I'll contact him. There's a reciprocity. We both want this. So the second thing I value in friendship is curiosity. I would characterise people I don't get on with as people who simply make statements all the time and expect me to either, believe those things or make statements back. And many people's conversation is like that. I really value conversation, debate, and that's always comes from curiosity.
Yeah.
And so therefore, I've said, I thought the purpose of education is to enable curiosity, but I think that's because that's what I want in the rest of my life as well. Not only do I think that there's a global gain if we can encourage curiosity, but I think there is an interpersonal one as well. And I think the third thing that I value in a friendship is warmth. Okay. I value people who are warm. And that's because we're not just rational beings, we are also emotional beings. And I think we can celebrate and enjoy both.
Yeah. I think that's lovely, isn't it? And I think that's true again. And one of the things that sadly I see quite a lot in the leaders that I work with, when I think about the primary colours sort of Venn diagram, is sometimes I see less interpersonal or less warmth, which is a shame, because for lots of them, I don't think they're not warm people. There's something dialed that down or turned off altogether, which is a real shame, I think.
The point about the interpersonal domain is that my experience of this comes from the I talked about the confluence of three streams. This comes from the consultancy stream. One of the things I've noticed is that the interpersonal domain holds the strategic and the operational in place. In other words, you can have the world's best strategy, but if people are offside, they won't implement it. It will fail. You can have a relatively poor or modest strategy, but an absolutely committed and loyal workforce will make it work. And so therefore the interpersonal domain, I think, kind of holds the other two in place. And therefore leaders who are not good at building relationships had better put people around them pretty swiftly who are.
Yeah, there you go. Brilliant. So in terms of the second ignition point, to jog your memory, you talked a little bit in the question about being a father and that being a key ignition point. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. My wife and I founded the Edgecombe Consulting Group. I'd been in 2 other consultancies before then, and we worked in it for 20 years, and then something like nearly 10 years ago handed it over to the next generation of people who were following us in the business. Yeah. In a sense, any opportunity that you have to rethink something is an ignition point. I had worked in 2 consultancies, and there were things that I didn't like in each of them. There were things that I did, and you know, I'm always grateful to the grounding that I got in those other 2 consultancies. But there were things and sometimes people that I just didn't like a whole lot and didn't have a lot of time for. And so creating our own consultancy meant that we had an opportunity to kind of put the thing together from first principles again. What do we believe in? What do we want to work for? What's our purpose? What are our values? And in many ways, incidentally, I talked earlier about the reason it's hard to lead in the world now is because of the speed and unpredictability of change. At a time when unpredictable change happens fast, you need to know very clearly 2 things. What is our purpose? And what are our values? Because those are the only 2 things that you can pull on at that time. And so having an opportunity to work that out from first principles was an ignition point for me. What we came up with, and sometimes we got them right at the start, and sometimes we had to modify them because we got them badly wrong. But the things that we came up with was that, firstly, Jenny and I wanted to create a world of work in which people could thrive, not just survive. Mm-hmm. And that meant for our clients, but of course we began to realise pretty quickly that it has to be like that in our own organisation first. You know, you can't. The admonition to practice what you preach is nothing like as strong as the one to preach what you practice. You know, that if you've got to get it right for you first. It's like they say on the aircraft: put your own oxygen mask on first before you try to help anybody else. Excuse me. I wanted to make it possible for people to leave work at the end of the day with the same smile on their face that they arrived with in the morning, because we'd put enough back in this kind of equation. You know, people talk about primary colours, but I did another book in lockdown, which was called Work-Life Matters, in which I was trying to get people to see that the focus on work-life balance is firstly a logical nonsense. You know, work's such an important part of life that you can't balance the part with the whole. But if you think about the balance, therefore, between work and home, I think that's it is one balance you can talk about. You know, the way you spend your time and commit yourself to these 2 different environments. But there's another balance, which is the balance in your work life. That is the balance in your life at work. And that is the balance between those things that give you energy and those that take it away. Okay. And what we wanted to try to do was to create an environment in which we, at the end of the day, had got that balance positive, so that we put back at least as much as we took out in terms of things like satisfaction and fun, joy, innovation, chances to try new things, support, you know, things that give people energy back. And that's a very personal equation, incidentally. You can't set it once and for all for an organisation. Yeah. You've got to have conversations all the time and let it be possible for people to tell you the things that drain them and the things that would put more back than perhaps they're getting at the moment. And that leads to a field called job crafting, in which you're trying to fit jobs to people, not people to jobs. Right. And so being a founder and having responsibility for, you know, feeding the individuals and families that are represented by your workforce gave us an opportunity to think about all of those things de novo, or at least to refresh our thinking about things. And I think we got more right than wrong. I don't think we were perfect in that respect, but I think we, on balance, were in positive territory.
God, there's so much hidden in that. There's definitely some lessons for leaders around energy in, energy out on a daily basis. I think that would be a fascinating reflection for people to take away. Something about how clear they are about their own purpose, principles, you know, because as you said, in a VUCA world when everything's going crazy, those are the things that are, you know, can be most stable. I think that's fascinating. And then the other one I was just thinking about is, just because you're not a founder of an organisation doesn't mean that you couldn't spend some time thinking about that. And certainly what you said then about refreshing. I mean, however you're leading at the moment, taking time to rethink about it and to maybe refresh that is probably a useful experience. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that organisations every now and again need to be reinvented.
Sure.
And so, in a sense, you become a founder of the new version.
Yeah.
And at any given time, you can choose to do that. Sometimes the reinvention is enormous and global and radical. You know, the best example of a really big shift I can think of was when IBM stopped making business machines. That was their whole raison d'etre for nearly 100 years. You know, and they became a consulting company. Now, I'm not talking about that kind of radical shift, although it does happen from time to time. In organisations, it happens roughly once every generation. You know, so for example, Menzies used to be a newspaper shop in Edinburgh, and over the next 125 years of their existence, were competing with W.H. Smith and that sort of thing on the high street. But now Menzies are a worldwide global aircraft handling company in airports all over the world. You know, they've reinvented themselves many different times. But on a smaller scale, you know, if you take over a team, you can go back to first principles and say, what's this team's purpose? What are this team's values? What are the things that we need to do to maximise the potential of this team? And in a sense, you become a founder of the next chapter or the next edition of that team.
That's great. Well, there's a challenge, a call to action for people. So the second launchpad that David showed was this idea of wicked problems, and you'll have much more knowledge of this than me, but I was fascinated when I tripped over this idea that potentially we should seek these things out and we shouldn't shy away from them because they could potentially provide us with the greatest opportunities for development. And when I started looking into it, again, albeit fairly briefly, there was this idea that wicked problems, you know, are wicked because they don't have a single solution. They're usually symptoms of larger issues. Each one of them is unique. You can't often experiment free with them, probably because of the interconnectedness. They typically involve multiple perspectives. There aren't any perfect solutions. There's no definitive endpoint, and they're difficult to define. And so my thinking went quickly to this idea that we probably should embrace, you know, the complexity, that we should focus on collaboration because, you know, none of us have all the answers, all the full picture or anything like that, that we need to be open and kind of honest about the challenges, the potential solutions and the trade-offs. And then this idea, going back to the VUCA stuff, I suppose, is that we always have to be adaptive and resilient to deal with those things. But tell us a bit about why this would resonate with you, David.
I work with this set of issues in a slightly different way, so perhaps important for me to just describe how I think about this. Firstly, I distinguish between puzzles and problems.
Okay.
A puzzle has a solution. Curing cancer is a puzzle. We haven't done it yet, but you know, because it's really difficult.
Yeah.
but curing the common cold is another one. You know. But however complex that is, it's still a puzzle.
Yeah.
There will be a solution. We will find it. But then there are what I call problems. Okay. And that's what you call a wicked problem, but I just call them a problem. A problem is not like a puzzle because a problem has people's feelings and values involved. So two people could have a puzzle. You know, I'm not talking about, you know, where I left my car keys. That's a puzzle, but you know, but rather, you know, two people can have a puzzle. You know, which is, I mean, maybe at one level, when somebody dies, you know, there might be if they're left intestate, that one of the issues might be how are we going to divide up, you know, the issues, the possessions in the family home or whatever it might be.
Yes.
And if you get on perfectly well and you've got a good relationship with your siblings or whoever, then you can do it on in a fairly sort of straightforward way. You can treat it as a puzzle and come up with a good solution. One of the ways that I've seen that work, for example, is that you simply monetize the value of each item, and then simply people can choose what they want, and it just gets deducted, and eventually you've got equal shares. So that you can turn that into a puzzle. But the problems arise when people's feelings and values are involved, and so one of the things that I reckon through decent communication, you can understand a person's values, you can understand their feelings, you can spend time kind of working with the individual to get to the bottom of what's happening for them, and you can kind of break through into the area of problems, but on a global scale, on a much bigger scale. So just as curing cancer is a puzzle, curing poverty is a problem.
Yes.
Because there aren't fair shares for all. It's a constantly moving target. People's values are involved, politics are involved, and so. But those are often the most important issues that we ever work with, and therefore I resonated to this idea of welcoming wicked problems, because for me that's the world of problems rather than puzzles. So I think that's critical. But the second thing I wanted to say is that I think that there is the potential to develop what I call an adaptive mindset. We are going to find as we move through life a great many issues that we've got to adapt to and got to work through, and we've maybe got to solve as problems. And an adaptive mindset, you've listed a number of the things that I think about as an adaptive mindset. One is about resilience. There's no point giving up too soon, so persistence is another one. The third one is teamworking, and the fourth one, not surprisingly, is my old friend curiosity. That if you can develop those four things, then the chances are you've got the best opportunity to adapt as you find yourself in new territory where problems abound rather than simply puzzles to be solved.
I love that. That is going to be. I'll have to ask for your permission to do this, but there's got to be a launchpad around puzzles versus problems. That is going to be my thinking for the rest of today. Amazing. Well, let's go into the last bit of this, and appreciate your time with this. But tell us a bit about this then. What personal quality do you think you need to develop the most? Surely you're the finished article, aren't you, David?
Oh, I'm practically perfect. I'm Mary Poppins, practically perfect in every way.
Yeah.
I think for me it's patience. Now, it's easy to reach for patience. It's a safe one. That lots of people would say that, but it really is. It really is an issue for me. If you think when I was a young man in a hurry I was obnoxious, you should see what I'm like as an old man in a hurry, because I've got less time. So, but the thing is that I think that with patience goes tolerance.
Right.
I have to remind myself to be tolerant. I don't think I'm naturally so. There's a psychometric called the Lumina Spark, and the Lumina Spark asks three kinds of questions when you're filling out this questionnaire. It's a personality questionnaire. It asks, what are you like, underneath it all. It asks, what do you like day to day when you're with people, maybe even in the workplace? And what do you like when you're stretched, when you're being pushed? And one of the things that I notice is that when the results for these three things are manifest for me, is that I am really underneath it all a kind of big picture thinker. I love to be able to work with concepts and ideas and possibilities which take me into the strategic domain as my natural home.
Yeah.
But when I'm at work, the interpersonal domain comes out much more.
Okay.
But that means it's not as natural as it could be, not should be, but as it could be. And as a result, there are times that I forget. And therefore, what happens is the trump card of my curiosity about ideas and possibilities trumps my well understood need to be kind and tolerant and understanding and patient.
Yes, nice.
And it makes me impatient. And I always, Chris, regret it. Always. And so that's the personal quality I'd like to develop the most, recognising, however, that some of the drive to get things done comes from the impatience. Yes. So it's not that I want to switch wholeheartedly into just I will never become Mother Teresa, sure. but I might be able to nudge myself much more towards the more naturally tolerant and understanding individual that I value and respect.
One of the funny things that's been happening to me during this podcast is, as I said before, a lot of alignment. But I'm finding myself feeling slightly guilty, saying, I'm just like Professor David Pendleton. It's probably more of a compliment.
No, you've got too much hair. You've got way too much hair, Chris. I'm sorry.
Maybe, yeah. Well, again, I'm conscious of your time, and so thank you. For being here. I mean, so generous with your time and so generous with your kind of input on things like LinkedIn and stuff. And so if anybody hasn't connected with David on LinkedIn, then definitely do so, because he is very generous and very insightful. Definitely connect with Primary Colors. We'll put all the links to all the books in the kind of podcast links. If you enjoyed the launchpad that we talked about, then check out the book, connect with me on socials. And so nothing left to say really apart from thank you. And
Chris, I should add one thing. I'm not sure my LinkedIn handle is at David Pendleton DPhil. I don't know, it might be. Is it? I don't know, it might be. Maybe just search for David Pendleton. But watch out for two things. There are two other David Pendletons I've come across. Never met either of them. One is a black American actor. Okay. And the other is a Canadian ventriloquist.
Oh my goodness!
and I don't know either of them. But if you search for Dr. David Pendleton, you won't get either of the other two.
Well, that would be maybe we should do a second version and invite those two on. Brilliant. Okay. Well, I'll see the rest of you at the next one.